You are listening to a selection from A Moment in the Wood by Joshua Harwood, copyright 2015, read by Amir Malik. Chapter 2. Edward did not like being so ill-prepared. He hadn't wanted to go off into the woods today, and being there without any provisions just made him nervous. But what was he to do? Victoria needed a guide, and who knows what trouble she might find without him. Who knew what trouble she would find with him as her guide, for that matter? "How far are you thinking we'll be going today?" asked Edward. "Oh, I don't know," replied Victoria. "I suppose we will go until we get tired, but I'm sure that won't be for quite a distance. It's early, and there is a lot of forest to explore. I know we won't get the whole thing today. However, I do intend to see as much as I can. Who knows when I'll have this little parental supervision again?" "I thought you said that we weren't going to go very far into the woods," rejoined Edward. "That was just so you would agree to come along," answered Victoria. "Oh, and don't worry about not having supplies. I hear there is an old well on a hill not too far down the path. We can get water there." "Oh, good. We are heading into the forest with our bags packed with only chapstick and rumors of water. My thirst is quenched already," said Edward, in a mildly sarcastic tone. "Don't forget the handkerchief. Please tell me you are not really going to whine the entire time, because if you are, you might as well go back now. I just won't have it," retorted Victoria. "No, I suppose not," said Edward, falling silent. And so their journey began, with Edward deeply concerned about what lay ahead, while Victoria smiled and hummed quietly to herself as she practically skipped down the path. Before too long, they came to a sign beside the path, which read, "The O Well." Accompanying the words was an arrow which pointed up a very steep hill. "See, what did I tell you?" exclaimed Victoria. "A well." Well, what do you know? You were right," conceded Edward. "Well, well, what do you know? A well," chimed Victoria. "Yes," replied Edward, "I admit, in the end you were right. It was here." "All's well that ends well. With a well," added Victoria, grinning at Edward. "I'm wishing we were at the end, but with this well to replenish us, it looks like we are not at the end, but at the beginning," lamented Edward. "Then this must be a wishing well because I wish to go well into the woods," said Victoria, turning her nose into the air at Edward, trying in vain to hide the little smile that was creeping across her lips. "Oh, stop it," said Edward gloomily, knowing that if he didn't put an end to this now, she might go on for some time. "Fine. I'm going up the hill to fetch some water. Are you coming, or shall I be wishing you well?" finished Victoria, bursting into laughter. "Oh, you really need to lighten up a bit if you are going to be any kind of company today." Victoria reached into her pocket and pulled out a penny. "Here," said Victoria, tossing the coin to Edward. "Let's go make some wishes." With that, Victoria turned and started to climb the hill jubilantly. Edward shook his head and followed, not knowing what else to say. As they neared the top, Edward noticed that the ground became increasingly wet and slippery, making it more and more difficult to maintain solid footing. But finally, Edward reached the top without incident shortly behind Victoria. For a moment, he just stood in place, huffing and puffing from the climb. "Wow, you are really out of shape, aren't you?" observed Victoria. "You must not get much exercise. You need to work on your cardio. If you don't, you will probably have a heart attack." "Thank you for your input. I'll be sure to take that under advisement," replied Edward, shaking his head. "Good, now let's get some water from this well. I'm absolutely parched," said Victoria. Victoria leaned down and picked up some rocks from the ground. Walking to the well, she leaned over its stone side and gazed into its darkness. "I wonder how deep it is," she pondered. "I can't see the bottom. Can you?" Edward peered over the edge into the darkness. "No, I can't. Maybe there's no water in it at all, and we will have to go home." He was pretty sure that wasn't the case, considering how much mud was at the top of the hill, but he didn't want to miss a chance to encourage her to go back. "Well, here's one way to find out if there is water," offered Victoria. With that, she took one of the stones she had picked up and dropped it down the well. A moment later, they heard a plunking noise as the stone broke the surface of the water. Not too deep," said Victoria, replacing the remaining stones back into her pocket. On the lip of the well sat a bucket attached to a rope, which was in turn attached to a pulley that hung above the opening of the well. Together they swung the little bucket over the opening and slowly worked the pulley, lowering the bucket into the depths below. After a moment had passed, the bucket gently splashed into the water. They allowed it to fill and then pulled the bucket back up, which was much more difficult as it was filled with water now. But soon the bucket was back at the top and pulled to the side of the well. Victoria cupped her hand and dipped it into the cool water. Just as she brought her hand to her lips to drink, Edward grabbed her wrist, jostling her, and making most of the water in her hand spill on the ground. "Wait, maybe that's not such a good idea," said Edward, looking a bit concerned. "And why not?" retorted Victoria. "Are you sure it's safe?" asked Edward. "It could be contaminated." "Contaminated? Why would it be contaminated?" said Victoria. "I don't know, but these things happen with water that gets left outside." "I'm sure it's fine," Victoria reassured him. "What about birds?" asked Edward. "What about birds?" said Victoria, raising her eyebrows. "Well, they fly over and maybe sometimes they, drop a little something in the well," offered Edward. "You are so gross. You know that?" said Victoria. "There could be other contaminants too. Maybe snakes or spiders could have." "Wait, just stop a moment. Are you trying to tell me that I shouldn't drink this water because you think spiders may have pooped in it? That is the dumbest thing I have ever heard of," yelled Victoria. "No, I just meant that," Edward started to reply. "Oh, please, just be quiet a moment and let me get a drink." And with that, Victoria scooped another handful of water and drank it. As she swallowed it, her eyes grew really big and she began to gasp and choke. "Ack!" she screamed, clutching her throat. "I think it's poisoned." "Oh no, what do we do? I knew you shouldn't drink it. It's contaminated," wailed Edward. Victoria stopped gagging, grinned, and splashed Edward with the water in the bucket. "It's fine, silly. I'm only playing. You are so dramatic." Edward stopped, realizing that he had been had. "Oh, very funny. So very clever," replied Edward sarcastically. "One of these days you are going to get in trouble and you will come crying to me, but I won't be able to save you. No, it will be too late. Then you will be in real trouble." Victoria just shook her head. Under her breath, she added, "Spider poop, really?" Then grinning at Edward, she asked, "Are you sure you won't have any?" Edward was not happy that Victoria was making light of what was a very serious matter. He knew that the water could be bad. On the other hand, he was very thirsty from the climb up the hill. "Fine, I'll have some. That way, if it's poison, we will be poisoned together and we will both die. That will save me from having to drag your lifeless body back home," said Edward. Victoria stared at him. "Are you sure you have ever been to the woods? Considering how worried you are about everything, I'm surprised you ever made it out of your bedroom." "Look, at least one of us needs to have some sense, and seeing as you don't seem to have any, I guess that leaves me," replied Edward, turning his head and sticking his nose in the air. Edward had taken about as much nonsense from Victoria as he could stand. It seemed clear that if he didn't take charge of the situation, someone was going to get hurt. "I've decided that it is time to go back home. The woods are just too dangerous, especially for someone like you who has no caution," declared Edward. "You decided," responded Victoria, with a slightly elevated tone to her voice. "Well then, you can also decide to stick a tree in your ear for all I care." With that, she crossed her arms and turned away from him. "I will not be ignored," exclaimed Edward, turning away from Victoria, determined to be the one doing the ignoring. But as he turned, he slipped, and as he slipped, he fell, and as he fell, he began to slide, and slide he did, not down the front of the hill, the way he had come, but rather down the back of the hill. As he slipped, he reached out to catch something to stop him. Unfortunately, what he caught was Victoria's ankle, which was planted on the same muddy surface from which Edward had just slipped. So instead of his grasp stopping him, he continued to slide, taking Victoria along with him. Victoria had only a moment's notice to realize what was happening as she felt her foot being swept out from under her. She reached out to grab anything to help her keep from falling, but all she caught was the side of the bucket. So Edward, Victoria, and the little wooden bucket slid down the backside of the hill together. They slid until the hill gave way to a small drop, and the two children and their bucket tumbled off its side. That is the end of Chapter 2.